The bullet struck the stone inches from Pearl Remington's head, sending fragments into her cheek as she scrambled deeper into the narrow canyon. Blood trickled down her face, mixing with the dust and sweat that already streaked her skin. Her shoulder throbbed where the first bullet had grazed her, the torn fabric of her dress now soaked with crimson. She pressed her back against the cool rock and tried to steady her breathing, clutching her father's old Colt revolver with white knuckles. She went this way. A gruff voice called out, echoing through the ravine. "Find her before sundown or Jenkins will have our hides." Pearl closed her eyes for a brief moment. 3 days ago, she'd been the respectable daughter of a prominent banker in Salida, Colorado. Now she was a fugitive, running for her life after witnessing something she was never meant to see. Her father's murder had not been the robbery gone wrong that the papers reported. It had been a calculated execution by the very men who now hunted her through the wilderness outside town. She peered around the edge of the boulder, her vision blurring from exhaustion and pain. The landscape before her was a maze of scrub brush and rock formations, bathed in the harsh afternoon sun of summer 1876. If she could just make it to the old mining cabin her father had shown her years ago, she might find temporary sanctuary. But first, she had to lose the men on her trail. Pearl took a deep breath and pushed off from the rock, half running, half stumbling through the narrow passage. Each step sent fresh waves of pain through her wounded shoulder. The hem of her once fine dress caught on a thorny bush, and she yanked it free with a muffled cry. Behind her, voices grew more distant as she navigated the twisting paths between the rocky outcroppings. The land began to slope upward, and Pearl's legs burned with the effort of climbing. She was accustomed to town life, to boardwalks and carriages, not this desperate scramble across wild terrain. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, and black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She couldn't stop. Not now. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Pearl finally spotted the weathered roof of the cabin. It was tucked against the hillside, half hidden by pine trees that provided blessed shade. With her last reserves of strength, she staggered toward it, praying that it would be empty. The door hung crookedly on rusty hinges, and Pearl pushed it open with her uninjured arm. The interior was dim and musty, with dust motes dancing in the faint shafts of light that filtered through cracks in the walls. It was small, just a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot against one wall. But to Pearl, it was salvation. She collapsed onto the cot, the world spinning around her. The pain in her shoulder had progressed from sharp stabs to a constant, burning throb. Pearl knew she needed to clean the wound to stop the bleeding, but darkness was encroaching on her consciousness. She fought against it, forcing herself to stay awake long enough to drag the small table across the floor, jamming it against the door as a makeshift barricade. As her vision tunneled and consciousness slipped away, Pearl thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Caleb Jenkins reined in his stallion at the top of the ridge, surveying the landscape below with practiced eyes. 5 years of riding as a ranch hand had taught him to read the land like a book, and something about the scene before him didn't sit right. He adjusted his worn leather hat to better shield his eyes from the setting sun, and studied the terrain more carefully. There was a flash of movement near the old Mac Gregor mining cabin. He narrowed his gaze, spotting 3 men on horseback circling the area like vultures. Their movements were furtive, predatory. These weren't just travelers or prospectors. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to the Winchester rifle secured in his saddle holster. At 26, he'd seen enough trouble to know it by sight, and whatever was happening down there had the distinct look of men hunting someone. He guided his horse down the slope, staying within the tree line to avoid being spotted. As he drew closer, snippets of conversation drifted up to him on the evening breeze. "She's gotta be around here somewhere. Tracks lead this way. Jenkins wants her found by morning, says she's the only one who can identify us. Damn banker's daughter. Should have killed her when we had the chance." Caleb's jaw tightened. So they were hunting a woman, a banker's daughter. The news of Harold Remington's murder had reached even the isolated Diamond Creek Ranch where Caleb worked. Word in town was that it had been a robbery gone wrong, but these men's conversation painted a different picture entirely. The men continued their search, moving toward the eastern ridge. Caleb waited until they were out of sight before approaching the cabin. If the woman they sought had come this way, she might be inside injured or worse. He dismounted silently, tethering his horse to a pine tree, and approached the cabin with his rifle ready. The door showed signs of recent use, fresh scratches around the handle, disturbed dust on the threshold. Caleb tried the door and found it blocked from inside. "Hello," he called softly, not wanting to startle whoever might be within. "I'm not with those men. I'm here to help." No response came from inside. Caleb pressed his shoulder against the door and pushed, feeling resistance from whatever barricade had been erected. With steady pressure, he managed to create enough space to slip through. In the dim interior, his eyes took a moment to adjust. When they did, he saw her, a young woman collapsed on a cot against the far wall. Blood stained the shoulder of her torn dress, and dirt and scratches marked her face. Despite this, Caleb could see she was beautiful, with copper-colored hair falling in tangled waves around her pale face. He crossed to her quickly, setting his rifle aside to check her pulse. It fluttered beneath his fingers, weak but present. Her skin felt hot to the touch, early signs of fever. "Miss," he said, gently shaking her uninjured shoulder. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing glimpses of green eyes clouded with pain and confusion. "Who?" she managed, trying to scramble away from him. "Easy now," Caleb said, his voice low and steady like he'd used to calm a spooked horse. "My name's Caleb Jameson. I work at Diamond Creek Ranch. I'm not going to hurt you." The woman struggled to focus on his face. "They're looking for me," she whispered. "I know, I saw them, but they've moved east for now." He glanced at her wounded shoulder. "You're hurt. I need to tend to that wound before infection sets in." Fear flashed across her face. "They killed my father," she said, her voice breaking. "They'll kill me too if they find me." Caleb's expression hardened with resolve. "They won't find you, I promise you that." He looked around the sparse cabin. "What's your name?" "Pearl," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Pearl Remington." "All right, Miss Remington. I'm going to help you, but first I need to clean that wound." "Do you think you can stay awake a little longer?" Pearl nodded weakly, wincing as she tried to sit up. Caleb supported her back, noting how she trembled with exhaustion and pain. "I have some supplies in my saddlebag," he told her. "I'll be right back. Don't you worry." As Caleb returned to his horse, his mind raced with possibilities. The men hunting Pearl would likely return to search this area more thoroughly. The cabin wasn't safe for long. But in her condition, Pearl couldn't travel far, certainly not on horseback through rough country. He gathered his canteen, a small medical kit, and some jerky he kept for long rides, then returned to the cabin. Pearl had managed to prop herself up against the wall, though her face was ashen with the effort. "You're the banker's daughter," Caleb said as he knelt beside her. "I heard about what happened in town. I'm sorry about your father." "It wasn't a robbery," Pearl said, her voice stronger now, fueled by anger. "It was murder. They came to the bank after hours. My father was meeting with Garrett Jenkins. He owns half the mining claims around Salida. I was in the back room and they didn't know I was there." She paused, swallowing hard. Jenkins accused my father of looking too closely at his accounts of finding discrepancies. Then he ordered his men to make it look like a robbery. Caleb's hand stilled as he was pouring water onto a clean cloth. Jenkins, Garrett Jenkins. The name of the man the Outlaws had mentioned. Pearl nodded, wincing as the movement jarred her injury. I ran. They saw me and shot at me, but I managed to escape through the alley. I've been hiding and running for 3 days now. Tears filled her eyes. No one in town would believe me over Jenkins. He's too powerful. I believe you, Caleb said firmly. Now I need to look at that wound. This might hurt. With gentle fingers, he pulled aside the torn fabric of her dress, revealing a deep graze across the top of her shoulder. The wound was angry and red, but thankfully, the bullet had only torn through flesh without hitting bone. He cleaned it carefully, apologizing each time Pearl gasped or tensed in pain. You've lost blood, but I think you'll be all right, he told her when he'd finished bandaging the wound with strips torn from his spare shirt. The fever's what worries me. You need rest and medicine. I can't rest, Pearl said, though her eyelids were already growing heavy. They'll come back. Caleb stood and moved to the cabin's single window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. The sun had set and dusk was settling over the landscape. We'll stay here tonight, he decided. You're in no condition to travel and they won't search well in the dark. Come first light, we'll move on. Pearl questioned, her voice small. Caleb turned back to her, his expression solemn. I'm not leaving you to face those men alone, Miss Remington. I'll help you get somewhere safe, and then we'll figure out how to bring Jenkins to justice. Relief washed over Pearl's face, followed quickly by suspicion. Why would you risk your life for someone you don't know? Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering her question. My pa taught me that a man's character is judged by what he does when no one's watching. I couldn't live with myself if I walked away knowing what might happen. He offered her a small smile. Besides, I've never much cared for bullies, especially ones who hide behind money and influence. Pearl's eyes searched his face, finding only sincerity in his steady gaze. Thank you, she whispered. Try to get some sleep now, Caleb said, draping his jacket over her. I'll keep watch. As Pearl drifted into an uneasy sleep, Caleb settled by the door with his Winchester across his lap. The night would be long, but his resolve was firm. Whatever came with the dawn, he would stand between this woman and those who sought to harm her. Outside, the Colorado wilderness fell silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant howl of a coyote. Caleb kept his eyes trained on the darkness, watching and waiting. Pearl awoke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the cabin's cracks. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her body ached so terribly. Then the memories flooded back: her father's murder, the desperate flight, the wound, and the stranger who had come to her aid. She turned her head to find Caleb Jameson still seated by the door, his rifle ready. He looked tired but alert, his broad shoulders outlined against the growing light. He must have kept watch all night. You're awake, he said, noticing her movement. How do you feel? Pearl took stock of her condition. Her shoulder throbbed dully, but the sharp, burning pain had subsided. Her head felt clearer, though weakness still permeated her limbs. Better, I think. The fever's gone, Caleb nodded, relief evident in his expression. Good, we should move soon. I checked outside at first light, no sign of them yet, but they'll be back. Pearl pushed herself into a sitting position, grimacing with the effort. Where will we go? Jenkins has men all over this territory if I go back to town. Not town, Caleb said firmly. At least not Salida. I've been thinking about it all night. There's an old trapper's cabin about 10 miles north of here, deeper into the mountains. Few people know about it and it's well hidden. We can stay there while you recover your strength. then figure out our next move." As Pearl attempted to stand, her knees buckled. Caleb was at her side instantly, his strong arm supporting her waist. The sudden proximity sent an unexpected flutter through Pearl's chest. Despite the dire circumstances, she found herself acutely aware of his presence, the weathered tan of his skin, the faint scent of leather and pine that clung to him, the gentle strength in the hand that steadied her. "Easy," he murmured. "You've been through a lot." Pearl straightened, determined not to appear weak. "I'll manage." She looked down at her tattered, blood-stained dress. "I'm not exactly dressed for a mountain journey." Caleb gave her a considering look. "I have an extra shirt in my saddlebag. It'll be too big, but it's clean and whole. And I have a spare bandana you can use to tie your hair back." While Caleb went to retrieve the items, Pearl took stock of her appearance. Her once fine dress was beyond salvation, torn and stained with blood and dirt. Her hair hung in tangled disarray around her face. She'd never been particularly vain, but the transformation from respectable banker's daughter to bedraggled fugitive was jarring. When Caleb returned with the promised items, he discreetly turned his back to allow Pearl privacy while she changed. The shirt was indeed too large, hanging nearly to her knees, but the sturdy cotton felt clean against her skin. She kept her dress's underskirt, tying Caleb's bandana around her waist to cinch the shirt. It wasn't proper attire for a lady, but propriety seemed a distant concern in her current situation. "I'm ready," she announced when she had finished. Caleb turned, his eyes widening slightly at her transformed appearance. Something unreadable flickered across his face before he nodded approvingly. "It'll be easier to ride in that," he said, "and less conspicuous from a distance." He helped her gather what few useful items they could find in the cabin: a dented tin cup, a small knife with a worn handle, a threadbare blanket. Every movement was executed with quiet efficiency, as though he was accustomed to preparing for quick departures. Outside, Pearl got her first clear look at Caleb's horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion with intelligent eyes and powerful haunches. The horse nickered softly as Caleb approached, nuzzling against his shoulder. "This is Rusty," Caleb said with obvious affection. "Best horse I've ever had. He's strong enough to carry us both, at least until we can find you a mount of your own." He helped Pearl onto the saddle first, then mounted behind her. The intimacy of the arrangement brought heat to Pearl's cheeks. In her previous life, sitting astride a horse with a man's arms around her would have been scandalously improper. Now, it was necessary for survival. Caleb kept Rusty at a steady trot, avoiding open spaces and staying within the cover of trees whenever possible. His body was a solid presence behind Pearl, warm and reassuring. Despite the persistent ache in her shoulder and the uncertain future ahead, Pearl found herself drawing comfort from his nearness. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Jameson," she said after they had been riding for some time, the silence broken only by the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats. "You know my story, but I know very little about you." Caleb was quiet for a moment, as though unaccustomed to speaking about himself. "Not much to tell," he finally said. "I was born in Missouri. My family headed west when I was 10, looking for a better life. Pa was a farrier by trade, but he dreamed of having his own ranch someday." "Did he get it? His ranch?" Pearl asked. A shadow passed over Caleb's face. "No, he and Ma died of fever when I was 17. After that, I worked wherever I could find employment: cattle drives, ranch hands, even mining for a spell. Ended up at Diamond Creek Ranch 3 years ago, working for Old Man Thompson." Pearl heard the loss in his voice, recognizing it as kin to her own grief. "I'm sorry about your parents," she said softly. "It was a long time ago," Caleb replied, though his tone suggested the wound had never fully healed. What about you? Besides being a banker's daughter, who is Pearl Remington? Pearl considered the question. Who was she really? For 22 years, she had been defined primarily by her relationship to others. Harold Remington's daughter, a proper young lady of Salida society, the woman that ambitious young men courted because of her father's position. Now, with her father gone and her place in society likely forfeit, she would need to discover the answer anew. "I'm not entirely sure anymore," she admitted. "I've always loved books, adventure stories especially. My mother died when I was young, so I was raised mostly by my father. He taught me about banking, about numbers and ledgers. I helped him at the bank sometimes." Her voice caught. "That's why I was there that night. We were preparing the monthly statements together." Caleb's arm tightened briefly around her waist, a gesture of comfort. "You're brave," he said simply. "Many would have broken under what you've endured." Pearl wanted to protest that she didn't feel brave. She felt terrified and overwhelmed, but she held her tongue. Perhaps bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the will to continue despite it. As the morning progressed, the terrain grew steeper and more challenging. The mountain air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the summer heat of the lower elevations. Pine trees towered around them, their scent sharp and clean in the sunlight. They stopped briefly at a small stream to rest and water Rusty. Caleb helped Pearl dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Her legs were stiff from riding, and she stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground. "Careful," Caleb said, steadying her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a current of awareness that transcended their precarious circumstances. Pearl was the first to look away, moving to the stream's edge to splash cool water on her face. The refreshing shock helped clear her mind, bringing her back to the reality of their situation. She was a witness on the run, and Caleb was risking his life to protect her. Whatever she might feel stirring in her heart was a complication neither of them needed. They ate a sparse meal of jerky and wild berries Caleb found growing nearby. Pearl watched as he constantly scanned their surroundings, his body tense with vigilance. It struck her that she had placed an enormous burden on his shoulders, yet he had accepted it without hesitation. "Why did you really decide to help me?" she asked suddenly. "The truth, please. It can't just be because of what your father taught you." Caleb regarded her thoughtfully, taking his time before answering. "When I was 19, I witnessed a man being beaten by 3 others in a mining camp. I did nothing. Told myself it wasn't my business, that getting involved would only bring trouble." His jaw tightened. "They killed him, over a card game and $20. He met Pearl's gaze directly. "I swore after that day that I would never again stand by while someone needed help. Not if I could do something about it." Pearl nodded, understanding dawning. "So it's about redemption." "Maybe in part," Caleb acknowledged, "but it's also about what's right. Jenkins and his men murdered your father and are hunting you to cover it up. That's wrong, plain and simple." As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant sound froze them both, the faint but unmistakable echo of men's voices, carried on the mountain breeze. "They're closer than I thought," Caleb muttered, quickly gathering their few belongings. "We need to move now." He helped Pearl back onto Rusty, then mounted behind her with fluid grace born of years in the saddle. With a gentle click of his tongue, he urged the horse forward, setting a faster pace than before. The voices behind them grew no louder, but Pearl couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in, step by inexorable step. She leaned back slightly against Caleb's chest, drawing strength from his unwavering presence as they rode deeper into the wilderness, away from all she had known and toward an uncertain future. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed higher into the mountains. Massive pine trees crowded the narrow trail, their branches casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. Rusty navigated the challenging path with sure-footed confidence, but even the strong stallion began to show signs of fatigue after hours of bearing their double weight up steep inclines. Pearl's shoulder throbbed with renewed intensity, each of Rusty's steps sending jolts of pain through her wound. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, not wanting to slow their progress or add to Caleb's concerns, but her resolve could only mask her suffering for so long. "You're trembling," Caleb said, his voice close to her ear. "We need to rest." "No," Pearl protested weakly. "They could still be following." "You'll be no good to either of us if you pass out and fall from this horse," Caleb replied firmly. "There's a sheltered clearing ahead where we can stop briefly." True to his word, the trail soon opened to a small clearing nestled against a rocky outcropping. A natural overhang provided shelter, and dense vegetation on three sides offered concealment. Caleb dismounted first, then reached up to help Pearl down. As her feet touched the ground, her legs buckled beneath her. Caleb caught her before she fell, lifting her effortlessly in his arms. The sudden closeness made Pearl's breath catch. She was acutely aware of his heartbeat against her side, the strength in the arms that held her so carefully. "I'm sorry," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "Don't apologize for being human, Miss Remington," Caleb said, carrying her to the sheltered area beneath the rock overhang. He set her down gently on a soft patch of pine needles. "You've endured more in the past few days than most people face in a lifetime." While Pearl rested, Caleb tended to Rusty, removing the saddle to give the horse a reprieve and allowing him to graze on the sparse mountain grass. He moved with quiet efficiency, always keeping Pearl within his sight and frequently scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of pursuit. "How much further to the trapper's cabin?" Pearl asked when he returned to her side. "Another few hours' ride," Caleb replied, kneeling to check her bandage. His fingers were gentle as they probed the edges of the wound. "The bleeding stopped, which is good, but you're running another fever." He reached for his canteen, helping Pearl drink. The water was cool and sweet, and she hadn't realized how parched she'd become until the first drop touched her lips. "Who owns this cabin we're headed to?" she asked after she'd drunk her fill. "An old trapper named Hank McKinney. He saved my life once when I got caught in a blizzard up here. Taught me mountain survival before he moved on to Oregon Territory 2 years ago." Caleb smiled slightly at the memory. "Said I was welcome to use the cabin whenever I needed." I don't think this is what he had in mind, but I reckon he'd approve. The brief rest revived Pearl somewhat, and though pain still radiated from her wound, she felt steadier when they resumed their journey. The day wore on, the sun arcing across the clear blue Colorado sky. They encountered no one, which Pearl found both relieving and eerie. The vastness of the wilderness around them was a sharp contrast to the bustle of Salida, where she'd spent most of her life. "What will we do once we reach the cabin?" she asked, breaking a long silence. Caleb considered the question before responding. "First, get you properly healed, then we need evidence against Jenkins. Your word alone won't be enough, not against a man with his influence." "The ledgers," Pearl said suddenly, remembering. "That's what they argued about." Father had found discrepancies in the mining company accounts. He kept separate notes in a red journal he always carried in his breast pocket. Would Jenkins have taken it? Pearl frowned, thinking back to that terrible night. "I don't think so. When I ran, they were. They were still standing over my father. The journal could still be at the bank or at our house." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "That's something, at least. A direction to move in once you're stronger." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Caleb finally pointed ahead. "There it is." Pearl followed his gesture and saw a small cabin nestled among a stand of tall pines. It was larger than the mining cabin where he'd found her, with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. It looked solid and well-maintained despite its obvious age. "It's not much," Caleb said, a hint of apology in his voice. "But it's sturdy, and McKinney built it to weather the harshest mountain winters. More importantly, it's virtually invisible from below. You can stand in the valley and look right at this hillside without spotting it." As they approached, Pearl noted other details: a small corral beside the cabin, a stack of firewood neatly covered to protect it from the elements, a narrow stream running nearby. It was a place built for self-sufficiency, far from the reach of civilization and its complications. Caleb dismounted first, scanning the area thoroughly before helping Pearl down. He kept a steadying hand at her elbow as they walked the short distance to the cabin door. A key hung from a nail hidden beneath the eave, and Caleb used it to unlock the door. McKinney believed in being prepared for visitors, he explained, ushering Pearl inside. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable: a main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with basic supplies, and 2 doorways leading to smaller rooms. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but otherwise, the cabin looked ready for habitation. "You take the bedroom on the right," Caleb said, setting down his saddlebag. "I'll use McKinney's old bunk in the other room." Pearl nodded gratefully, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. The past days caught up with her all at once, and she swayed on her feet. Caleb was at her side immediately. "Let's get you settled first. Everything else can wait." The small bedroom contained a narrow bed with a straw mattress, a chest for storage, and a window overlooking the forest. Caleb helped Pearl to the bed, his touch impersonal yet somehow still comforting. "I'll get a fire going and heat some water," he said. "There should be dried meat and beans in the storage cellar. Not exactly fine dining, but it'll keep our strength up." Pearl caught his hand as he turned to leave. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Caleb's expression softened, and for a moment the guarded look in his eyes gave way to something warmer. "Try to rest," he said quietly. "You're safe here." As he left the room, Pearl sank back onto the mattress, allowing her body to relax for the first time in days. The cabin's sturdy walls and Caleb's reassuring presence combined to create a sense of security she had thought forever lost after witnessing her father's murder. Outside the small window, the sun cast long shadows through the pines. Pearl watched the play of light until her eyelids grew heavy and sleep claimed her, carrying her away from pain and fear into blessed darkness. When Pearl awoke, the cabin was dark except for the warm glow of firelight seeping under her door. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in her bedroom in Salida, that the past days had been nothing but a terrible nightmare. Then the pain in her shoulder reasserted itself, and reality came flooding back. She sat up slowly, testing her strength. Her head felt clearer, though her body still ached from the long ride and her wound. Someone Caleb had removed her boots and covered her with a quilt while she slept. The small act of kindness brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Pearl blinked them away and rose from the bed, finding her balance before moving to the door. When she opened it, the main room lay before her, illuminated by a crackling fire in the stone hearth. Caleb sat at the table, cleaning his Winchester rifle with methodical care. He looked up at her approach, his expression shifting from concentration to concern. "You should be resting," he said, setting aside the cleaning cloth. "I've slept enough," Pearl replied, though in truth she felt as though she could sleep for days. "What time is it?" "Just past midnight. You've been asleep since we arrived this afternoon." He gestured to a pot hanging near the fire. "There's stew if you're hungry, nothing fancy, but it's hot." Pearl's stomach growled at the mention of food, reminding her that she'd eaten little in the past days. Stew sounds wonderful. Caleb rose and dished a generous portion into a bowl, then pulled out a chair for her at the table. As Pearl sat and began to eat, she realized just how ravenous she was. The stew was simple beans, dried meat, and a few wild onions, but it tasted better than any fine dining she'd experienced in Salada. "This is good," she said between bites. "Where did you learn to cook?" A hint of a smile touched Caleb's lips. When you live mostly on cattle drives and in bunkhouses, you either learn to cook or you eat poorly. I chose the former. Pearl studied him as she ate, seeing him properly for the first time since he'd found her. In the firelight, his features were striking: strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble, straight nose, eyes that seemed to shift between blue and gray depending on the light. He was handsome in a rugged, unpolished way that bore little resemblance to the carefully groomed young men who had courted her in Salada. "Tell me more about Garrett Jenkins," Caleb said, breaking into her thoughts. "What kind of man is he?" Pearl set down her spoon, appetite diminishing at the mention of the man responsible for her father's death. "He came to Salada about 5 years ago, made his fortune in silver mining, or so he claims. He owns the biggest house in town, donates to every charitable cause, attends church every Sunday." Her voice hardened. "And he's utterly ruthless. My father used to say that behind every charming smile, Jenkins was calculating profit margins. What made your father look into his accounts? It started with discrepancies in the payroll for the miners. Father noticed that Jenkins was withdrawing enough money to pay 50 men, but tax records showed only 35 employees at the mine. When Father inquired discreetly, Jenkins claimed the difference was for contract workers." Pearl frowned. "Then there were unusual transfers to banks in Denver and San Francisco. Large sums that didn't match the mine's reported output. You think he's running an illegal operation of some kind?" Caleb asked. Pearl nodded slowly. Father believed so. He suspected Jenkins was either skimming profits to avoid taxes or— She hesitated, remembering her father's troubled expression the week before his death. Or that the mine was a front for something else entirely. Caleb leaned back in his chair, considering this information. "If we could find that journal, it might provide enough evidence to take to the federal marshal in Denver. Local law won't touch Jenkins, but federal authorities might. If it still exists," Pearl said quietly, "and if we can get to it without getting killed." The reality of their situation hung heavy between them. They were two people alone against a powerful man with resources and hired guns at his disposal. The odds were daunting at best. "One step at a time," Caleb finally said. "First, you need to heal, then we'll figure out how to get that journal." Pearl finished her stew in thoughtful silence. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, an owl hooted softly in the darkness. "You should go back to bed," Caleb suggested, taking her empty bowl. "Your body needs rest to recover. What about you?" Pearl asked, noticing the tired lines around his eyes. "Have you slept at all?" Caleb shook his head. "I'll keep watch a while longer. Old habits." Pearl wanted to protest, to insist that he needed rest as much as she did, but the determined set of his jaw told her it would be futile. This was a man accustomed to putting others' needs before his own, a trait both admirable and frustrating. "Wake me in a few hours," she said instead. "I can take a turn watching." Surprise flickered across Caleb's face, followed by something like respect. "We'll see," was all he said. Pearl returned to the small bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. She lay awake for some time, listening to the quiet sounds of Caleb moving about the main room, the occasional shift of logs in the fireplace. Despite the uncertainty of their situation, she felt safer than she had since witnessing her father's murder. It was a strange feeling finding security in a remote cabin with a man she barely knew. Yet something about Caleb Jameson inspired trust. Perhaps it was the steadiness in his gaze, or the way he had risked his own safety without hesitation to protect her. Whatever the reason, Pearl found herself grateful for his presence as she drifted once more into sleep. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, sunlight filtering through the pines surrounding the cabin. Pearl woke feeling stronger, the fever that had plagued her now fully broken. She found her boots beside the bed and pulled them on before venturing into the main room. Caleb was nowhere to be seen, but the cabin door stood open to the fresh mountain air. A pot of coffee simmered near the banked fire, filling the space with its rich aroma. Pearl poured herself a cup in a tin mug she found on the table, then stepped outside onto the small porch. The view took her breath away. From this elevation, she could see for miles rolling foothills giving way to the vast plains to the east, majestic peaks rising to the west. The morning light painted the landscape in gold and amber hues, highlighting the rugged beauty of the Colorado wilderness. Movement caught her eye, and she spotted Caleb by the small stream that ran near the cabin. He was shirtless, splashing water over his face and torso. The sight made Pearl's cheeks warm, and she started to turn away to give him privacy when he noticed her presence. "Morning," he called, reaching for a shirt hanging from a nearby branch. "Coffee's fresh. Hope I didn't wake you." "You didn't," Pearl replied, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest as he approached, pulling his shirt over well-defined muscles that spoke of years of physical labor. "I think I've slept more in the past day than in the entire week before," Caleb smiled, and Pearl was struck by how it transformed his usually solemn face. "Good. How's the shoulder?" "Better. Still sore, but the fever's gone." He nodded approvingly. "Let me check the wound after breakfast." "I found some yarrow growing nearby. It'll help with the healing if we make a poultice." They shared a simple meal of corn cakes made from supplies Caleb had found in the cabin's storage, along with the last of the jerky. As they ate, Caleb outlined his plans for their immediate future. "We need supplies if we're going to stay here a while," he explained. "There's a small settlement about 10 miles west of here, not much more than a trading post and a few cabins. The man who runs it, Silas Montgomery, is trustworthy. I've done business with him before." "Won't it be dangerous to go into even a small settlement?" Pearl asked worriedly. "Jenkins might have spread word about me." "It's a risk," Caleb admitted. "But Silas isn't one to pay attention to outside affairs, and the place is remote enough that news travels slowly." "I can be there and back by nightfall," Pearl frowned. "I should come with you." "No," Caleb said firmly. "You're still recovering, and it's safer for you to remain here. The cabin is well hidden, and I'll show you how to secure it before I leave." Though she disliked the idea of being left alone, Pearl recognized the wisdom in his words. She was in no condition for another long ride, and her presence might indeed draw unwanted attention. After breakfast, Caleb checked her wound, his touch clinical yet gentle as he removed the old bandage. The angry red of the injury had faded somewhat, and the skin around it looked healthier. "It's healing well," he pronounced. "The bullet only grazed you, thankfully. Another inch and—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Pearl understood the implication. He applied a poultice of crushed yarrow leaves, securing it with a fresh bandage. The proximity was unsettling not because Pearl felt threatened, but because she found herself increasingly aware of him as a man rather than merely her protector. It was an inconvenient complication in an already complicated situation. Before departing for the trading post, Caleb showed Pearl the cabin's defenses, a heavy bar for the door, shutters that could be secured from inside, a trapdoor beneath the bearskin rug that led to a small root cellar where she could hide if necessary. "Take this," he said, placing his revolver on the table. "Do you know how to use it?" Pearl picked up the weapon, feeling its weight. "My father taught me. He believed a woman should know how to protect herself, especially in a place like Salida." Caleb raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Your father was an unusual banker." "He was an unusual man," Pearl replied, a wave of grief washing over her. She swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat. "He would have liked you, I think." Something unreadable flickered in Caleb's eyes. "I'll be back before sunset," he promised. "Keep the door barred and don't open it for anyone but me." Pearl watched from the doorway as he saddled Rusty and mounted with fluid grace. He paused at the edge of the clearing, turning back to meet her gaze one last time before disappearing among the trees. Alone in the cabin, Pearl felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and liberation. For days, she had been either fleeing for her life or dependent on Caleb's protection. Now, for a few hours at least, she had time to collect her thoughts and consider her situation more carefully. She busied herself tidying the already neat cabin, finding comfort in the simple, domestic tasks. In a trunk near the fireplace, she discovered a few books, a worn Bible, a manual on wilderness survival, and surprisingly, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. Pearl smiled at the unexpected find, wondering about the old trapper who had left it there. The hours passed quietly. Pearl read for a while, then dozed in a chair near the fire. She was awakened by a sound that made her blood run cold, the distant but unmistakable report of a rifle shot, echoing through the mountains. Pearl leapt to her feet, heart pounding. She rushed to the window, straining to see through the trees, but the forest revealed nothing. The shot could have been a hunter, she told herself. There was no reason to assume it had anything to do with Caleb or her pursuers. But as the shadows lengthened and the sun began its descent toward the western peaks with no sign of Caleb's return, fear took root and grew. He had promised to be back by sunset. What if Jenkins's men had found him? What if he was injured or worse? Pearl paced the cabin, alternating between watching the trail through the window and listening for hoofbeats. The revolver Caleb had left her sat heavily in her hand. As darkness fell, she lit a lantern but kept it dim, not wanting to draw attention to the cabin should anyone be searching the area. When the sound of approaching hooves finally came, it was well past sunset. Pearl positioned herself beside the window, revolver ready, and peered cautiously through a crack in the shutters. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Rusty's distinctive gait and Caleb's broad-shouldered silhouette. But something was wrong. Even in the dim moonlight, she could see that he sat slumped in the saddle, and Rusty moved with uncharacteristic slowness, as though careful not to jostle his rider. Pearl unbarred the door and rushed outside, caution forgotten in her concern. "Caleb, what happened?" As she drew closer, she saw the dark stain spreading across his left side, just below his ribs. Caleb looked down at her with pain-glazed eyes. "Got into a bit of trouble," he managed through clenched teeth. "Seems Jenkins's reach is longer than we thought." Pearl helped him dismount, supporting his weight as best she could despite the painful protest from her injured shoulder. Blood soaked his shirt, warm and sticky against her hand. "Inside," she urged, guiding him toward the cabin. "Can you make it?" Caleb nodded grimly, leaning heavily on her as they crossed the short distance to the door. Once inside, Pearl helped him to a chair near the fire, then hurried to secure the door and retrieve the medical supplies. "What happened?" she asked as she carefully helped him remove his bloodied shirt. Caleb winced as the fabric pulled away from the wound. "Was nearly finished at the trading post when 3 men rode in. Didn't recognize them at first, but they knew me. He paused, drawing a painful breath. Asked if I'd seen a woman matching your description. Said there was a reward for information. Pearl's hand stilled as she cleaned the wound. They're looking for me this far out. Jenkins must have put the word out across the territory, Caleb confirmed. I denied seeing anyone, finished my business and left. They followed. His jaw tightened. Ambushed me about 5 miles east of here. I managed to lose them in the higher passes, but not before one of them got off a lucky shot. The wound was a deep furrow along his ribs where a bullet had grazed him, similar to Pearl's own injury, but more severe. It was bleeding freely, though the bullet hadn't lodged in his flesh. I need to stop the bleeding, Pearl said, fighting to keep her voice steady. She pressed a clean cloth against the wound, trying to remember what her father had once taught her about treating injuries. This needs stitching. Caleb nodded toward his saddlebag, which he dropped near the door. Silas gave me a medical kit. Should be needle and thread in there. Pearl retrieved the kit, her heart racing at the task before her. She had sewn fine embroidery and mended clothing, but never human flesh. Yet there was no one else to do it, and the wound wouldn't stop bleeding on its own. I've never done this before, she admitted, threading the needle with hands that trembled slightly. Caleb's eyes met hers, steady despite the pain he must be feeling. I trust you, Pearl. It was the first time he had called her by her given name without the formal Miss preceding it. The simple statement of trust steadied her nerves. Pearl took a deep breath and began to work, forcing herself to focus on the task rather than the fact that it was Caleb's blood on her hands. Caleb's pain she was causing with each careful stitch. He remained stoically silent throughout the procedure, his only reaction an occasional sharp intake of breath or tightening of his jaw. When Pearl finally tied off the last stitch and covered the wound with a clean bandage, she was shaking with exhaustion and relief. Thank you, Caleb said softly, his voice rough with pain. You have steady hands. Pearl gave a tremulous smile. Not as steady as I would have liked. She wiped her bloodied hands on a cloth. You need to rest now. Let me help you to your bed. With Pearl's support, Caleb made it to the small bedroom he had been using. She helped him lie down, concern mounting at how pale his face had become. The supplies, he said as she turned to leave. I got everything we needed. Food, ammunition, medicine. It's all in the saddlebags. Don't worry about that now, Pearl told him. We'll sort it in the morning. You need to sleep. Caleb caught her wrist as she pulled the blanket over him. They're still out there, Pearl. Those men. They might have followed me despite my precautions. Fear clutched at Pearl's heart, but she kept her expression calm for his sake. Then I'll keep watch tonight. You've done enough. He looked as though he wanted to protest, but weakness and pain won out. His eyes drifted shut, his breathing gradually evening out as sleep claimed him. Pearl returned to the main room, securing the cabin before taking up position near the window with Caleb's revolver close at hand. Outside, the forest was silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of wind through the pines. As she kept her vigil, Pearl reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than a week. The sheltered existence she had known in Salida seemed a lifetime away. That Pearl Remington, the banker's proper daughter who attended socials and church functions, would scarcely recognize the woman who now sat guard with a revolver, who had stitched a man's wounds and fled across the wilderness with him. Most surprising of all was the realization that despite the danger and hardship, Pearl felt more alive than she ever had before. Every sensation seemed heightened: the crisp mountain air, the vivid colors of the forest, the comforting crackle of the fire. Even the fear had a certain clarifying effect, stripping away pretense and revealing what truly mattered. And somewhere amid the chaos and fear, Something else had taken root, something she was not yet ready to examine too closely. But as the night deepened around the small cabin, Pearl found her thoughts returning again and again to the man sleeping in the next room, and the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. The next 3 days passed in a tense but peaceful rhythm. Pearl tended Caleb's wound, which showed no signs of infection thanks to her careful stitching and the medicinal herbs he had obtained from the trading post. Though still weak from blood loss, he insisted on taking his turn at watch during the night, allowing Pearl to rest. They spoke little during those days, each lost in their own thoughts about the precarious situation they shared. Yet a companionable silence grew between them, the quiet understanding of two people who had faced danger together and found trust in unlikely circumstances. On the 4th morning, Pearl woke to find Caleb already up, moving about the cabin with greater strength than he had shown since his injury. He had prepared a breakfast of flapjacks and coffee, using supplies from his successful but costly trip to the trading post. "You're looking better," Pearl observed as she joined him at the table. Caleb nodded, pouring coffee for them both. "Feeling it too. Your nursing skills are impressive, Miss Remington." The return to formality caught Pearl's attention. Something had shifted in his demeanor, a certain resolution that hadn't been there before. "What is it?" she asked directly. "Something's on your mind." Caleb met her gaze evenly. "We need to make a decision. Those men at the trading post know I'm in the area. If they connect me to you, it won't take long for them to start searching these mountains more thoroughly." "You think we should leave?" Pearl said, understanding immediately. "I think we need a plan beyond hiding," Caleb corrected. "Jenkins won't stop looking for you. Not as long as you're the only witness to your father's murder." Pearl's appetite vanished. She pushed her plate away, considering their limited options. "The journal is our only hope of proving what Jenkins did. Without it, it's just my word against his." "Then we need to get that journal," Caleb said simply, as though suggesting nothing more dangerous than a trip to town for supplies. "You can't be serious," Pearl protested. "Going back to Salida would be suicide. Jenkins practically owns the town." "Not Salida," Caleb agreed. "But your father's journal has to be somewhere, either at the bank or your home, if we could get someone trustworthy to look for it." Pearl frowned, thinking of the people she had known in Salida. Who among them could she trust with such a dangerous task? Most of her friends were the daughters of merchants or ranchers who did business with Jenkins. The bank employees were loyal to her father, but would they risk their livelihoods or their lives to help her now? Then a name came to her. "Margaret Wilson," she said. "She was our housekeeper for 15 years, more like family than a servant. If anyone would help us, it would be her." Caleb considered this. "Could you get a message to her without alerting Jenkins or his men?" "Perhaps. She has a sister who lives in Denver." "I could send a letter addressed to the sister but meant for Margaret." Pearl's mind raced with possibilities. "Margaret knows every inch of our house. If the journal is there, she could find it." "It's risky," Caleb cautioned, "if the letter were intercepted." "I could write it in a way that only Margaret would understand," Pearl insisted. "Father and I used to play a game with coded messages when I was young. Margaret was often part of it." Caleb studied her for a long moment, seeming to weigh her determination against the danger of the plan. Finally, he nodded. "All right, write your letter. I'll find a way to get it to Denver without it being traced back to us." Relief washed through Pearl. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was action, a step toward justice for her father rather than endless hiding. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb's expression softened. "Don't thank me yet. We're a long way from proving anything against Jenkins." They spent the morning drafting the letter. Pearl chose her words carefully, embedding instructions for Margaret within seemingly innocent inquiries about family matters and town gossip. The final result appeared to be nothing more than a letter from a niece to her aunt in Denver, mentioning that she was staying with friends in Colorado Springs for her health. "Now we need to get this to Denver," Caleb said, examining the sealed envelope. "I can't risk the trading post again so soon. Those men might still be watching it." "What about the stagecoach route?" Pearl suggested. "There's a stop at Miller's Creek about 15 miles east of here." "It's small just-away station for changing horses, but they would accept mail for the Denver coach." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "It could work. I'd need to be careful, avoid being recognized, but it's our best option." He glanced at Pearl, concern evident in his eyes. "I don't like leaving you alone again so soon." "I'll be fine," Pearl assured him, though the memory of his return from the trading post, wounded and bleeding, sent fear curling through her stomach. "The cabin is well hidden, and I know how to use the revolver if necessary." Caleb didn't look convinced, but he recognized the necessity of their plan. "I'll leave at dawn tomorrow," he decided. "If I ride hard, I can reach Miller's Creek by midday, post the letter, and be back before dark." That evening they prepared for Caleb's journey. Pearl packed a small bundle of food while Caleb cleaned and checked his weapons. The air between them was charged with unspoken concerns: the danger of separation, the risk of discovery, the slim chance that their plan would succeed. As Pearl handed Caleb the packed food, their fingers brushed. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and found in it something that made her breath catch a warmth that went beyond the camaraderie of shared danger. "Be careful tomorrow," she said softly. "I will," he promised. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "Pearl, if anything happens to me, don't," she interrupted, unwilling to hear the contingency plans he was about to outline. "You'll be back by sunset. We'll proceed from there." Caleb studied her face, seeming to draw strength from her certainty. "All right then, by sunset." That night, as Pearl lay in her small bedroom listening to the quiet sounds of Caleb moving about the main room, she acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. Somewhere amid the fear and flight, the shared danger and quiet moments of safety, she had begun to care for Caleb Jameson as more than just her protector. The realization was both frightening and exhilarating, but what future could possibly exist for them? Even if they succeeded in exposing Jenkins, Pearl's life in Salida was destroyed. And Caleb, a ranch hand with no fixed home and few possessions, what could he offer beyond the protection he had already provided? Pearl pushed these thoughts aside. Tomorrow would bring enough challenges without borrowing more from an uncertain future. For now, it was enough that they had each other's trust and a fragile plan that might lead to justice. Morning came too quickly, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten as Caleb prepared to depart. Pearl stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching as he saddled Rusty and checked his weapons one final time. "Remember, stay inside," Caleb instructed. "Bar the door, keep the shutters closed. I'll give 3 knocks, then 2 when I return. That way you'll know it's me." Pearl nodded, fighting against the dread that had settled in her stomach overnight. "I'll be waiting." Caleb hesitated, then crossed to where she stood. For a moment, Pearl thought he might embrace her, might give voice to the unspoken current that had been growing between them. Instead, he simply touched her cheek briefly, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Take care," he said quietly, then turned and mounted Rusty in one fluid motion. Pearl watched until horse and rider disappeared among the trees, then slowly closed and barred the cabin door. The space seemed suddenly larger and emptier without Caleb's presence. She busied herself with small tasks, stoking the fire, preparing a simple breakfast, checking the revolver he had left for her protection. As the sun climbed higher, Pearl tried to imagine Caleb's progress. By now, he would be well on his way to Miller's Creek, perhaps navigating the steeper passes that led down toward the stage coach route. She pictured him alert in the saddle, watchful for any sign of danger, his lean frame silhouetted against the vast Colorado sky. The hours crawled by. Pearl read from the Book of Sonnets to pass the time, finding unexpected comfort in the familiar rhythms of Shakespeare's poetry. Occasionally, she moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters to scan the surrounding forest. Midday came and went. If all had gone according to plan, Caleb would have reached Miller's Creek by now, would have posted the letter and begun the journey back. Pearl prepared a stew with some of their supplies, ensuring a hot meal would be waiting upon his return. As afternoon waned toward evening, her anxiety mounted. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in deepening shades of gold and crimson. Caleb had promised to return by sunset, but there was still no sign of him. Pearl paced the cabin, alternating between the window and the door, straining to hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The shadows lengthened, and still he did not come. Night fell fully, the forest outside growing dark and still. Pearl kept the fire burning, its light a beacon should Caleb be making his way back in the darkness. She tried to rationalize the delay. Perhaps the stage coach had been late, or he had needed to take a longer route to avoid being followed. There could be a dozen innocent explanations for his absence. Yet as the hours passed, darker possibilities intruded. What if Jenkins's men had found him? What if he lay injured or dead somewhere between Miller's Creek and the cabin by midnight? Pearl had worn a path in the cabin floor with her pacing. Sleep was impossible, her mind conjuring increasingly terrible scenarios with each passing hour. She kept the revolver close, jumping at every nocturnal sound from the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the pines, the distant howl of a wolf. Dawn broke with still no sign of Caleb. Pearl stood at the window, watching as the forest emerged from darkness into the gray light of early morning. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, and her heart felt leaden in her chest. The sound, when it finally came, was so faint that Pearl thought she might have imagined it the distant but unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats approaching from the east. She rushed to the door, revolver in hand, listening intently. Yes, there it was again, closer now. But something about the cadence was wrong. It wasn't the steady gait of a single horse that she had come to associate with Rusty. This was the sound of multiple mounts moving at an unhurried pace. Cold fear washed through Pearl as she realized the implications. Not Caleb returning, but riders searching the area, perhaps the very men who had ambushed him at the trading post, now following his trail to the cabin. Moving quickly but quietly, Pearl gathered essential supplies, the revolver and ammunition, a canteen of water, the small knife Caleb had left on the table, a bundle of jerky. She stuffed these into a small pack, then moved to the bearskin rug covering the trapdoor to the root cellar. The riders were close now, their voices carrying through the morning air though the words were indistinct. Pearl lifted the rug and pulled open the trapdoor, revealing a dark space below. She had just lowered herself into the cellar and pulled the trapdoor closed above her when she heard the unmistakable sound of horses entering the clearing outside the cabin. In the dim light filtering through the cracks of the floorboards, Pearl could make out the root cellar's contents: shelves of preserved foods, sacks of root vegetables, barrels that likely contained flour or grain. She pressed herself into the darkest corner, revolver clutched in hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm. Above, she heard the creak of footsteps on the cabin's porch, followed by a heavy pounding on the door. "Hello, the cabin," a gruff voice called. "Open up." Pearl held her breath, heart hammering so loudly she feared it might be heard through the floorboards. When no answer came from within the cabin, there was a murmured conversation, then the sound of the door being forced open. Boots thumped across the floor above her head. "Someone's been here recently," a different voice observed. "Fire's still warm." "Check the bedrooms," the first voice commanded. "Johnson, look outside, see if there are tracks leading away from here." Pearl could hear them moving through the cabin, opening doors, rummaging through the few possessions she and Caleb had left visible. A moment of panic seized her when footsteps paused directly above the trapdoor, but they moved on without discovering her hiding place. "Nothing here, Roy," a third voice reported, "but someone's definitely been staying here. 2 people, by the looks of it. Both bedrooms were used." "Has to be Jameson and that Remington woman," the one called Roy said. "Question is, where are they now? Found something?" Called a voice from outside. The cabin door banged open as the man called Johnson returned. "Horse tracks heading west, maybe a day old. Looks like just one rider, though." "Jameson," Roy concluded. "Probably went for supplies, leaving the woman here. But where is she now?" "Think she heard us coming and ran," Johnson suggested. "Maybe, or maybe she's still close by, hiding." There was a considering pause. "We'll search the area. She can't have gone far on foot, not in these mountains." Pearl pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle a sound of fear. They knew who she was, knew that Caleb had been harboring her, and they were hunting them both. The men continued to search the cabin, growing increasingly frustrated as they found no clear sign of her whereabouts. They overturned furniture, emptied cupboards, even ripped apart the bedding in both rooms. "Nothing," Roy finally said, his voice tight with anger. "She's not here." "What now?" Johnson asked. "We wait," came the decisive response. "Jameson will be back eventually. When he returns, we'll have them both." Pearl's blood ran cold at these words. They were setting a trap for Caleb. If he returned to the cabin, unaware of the danger, he would ride straight into an ambush. The men settled in to wait, their occasional conversation drifting down to Pearl's hiding place. From their words, she gleaned that they were indeed Jenkins's men, sent to silence the only witness to Harold Remington's murder. They had been tracking Caleb since the confrontation at the trading post, losing his trail temporarily, but picking it up again near Miller's Creek. "Jenkins is offering an extra $500 for the woman," Roy commented at one point. "Says it's important she doesn't talk to anyone about what she thinks she saw." "What about Jameson?" Johnson asked. "Him too? Can't have him spreading stories about Jenkins. Bad for business." Pearl leaned her head against the earthen wall of the cellar, despair threatening to overwhelm her. These men intended to kill both her and Caleb on Jenkins's orders, and unless she found a way to warn him, Caleb would walk into their trap unaware. But how could she possibly get past 3 armed men and escape into the wilderness? Even if she managed it, how would she find Caleb in the vast expanse of the Colorado mountains? As the day wore on, Pearl remained hidden in the root cellar, scarcely daring to move for fear of making a sound that might alert the men above. Her limbs grew cramped and stiff, but terror kept her motionless. The only advantage she had was that they didn't know about the cellar, didn't know she was directly beneath their feet. Through cracks in the floorboards, Pearl could see shifting patterns of light as the sun traversed the sky. The men grew restless as hours passed with no sign of Caleb's return. They took turns patrolling outside, always leaving at least one man in the cabin. "He should have been back by now," Johnson said as afternoon deepened toward evening. "Maybe he's not coming back." "He'll come," Roy insisted. "His things are still here, and he won't leave the woman." The certainty in Roy's voice struck Pearl with a sudden, painful insight. He was right. Caleb would come back for her, walking straight into danger because he wouldn't abandon her. The knowledge was both comforting and devastating. As Pearl sat in the darkness, weighing impossible options, fate intervened in an unexpected form. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the mountains, followed by another, closer one. The men above fell silent, listening. "Storm's coming," Johnson observed. "Big one by the sound of it." "Damn," Roy muttered. "If it hits before Jameson returns, it'll wash out any tracks. We might miss him entirely." Pearl's heart quickened. A storm might provide the distraction she needed: cover for noise, reduced visibility, a chance to slip away unnoticed. It was a desperate hope, but the only one she had. The storm approached with the dramatic swiftness common to mountain weather. Wind began to howl around the cabin, rattling the shutters and moaning through the eaves. The first heavy drops of rain struck the roof like pebbles, quickly building to a steady downpour. Above, the men argued about their position. "If he's out in this, he might hole up somewhere until it passes," one suggested. "We could be waiting all night." "We stick to the plan," Roy insisted. Two men inside, one watching from the trees. "Rotate every 2 hours." Lightning flashed, illuminating the root cellar through the floorboard cracks. Thunder followed almost immediately, directly overhead. The storm was at its peak, wild and violent, nature's fury unleashed upon the mountains. It was now or never. If Pearl waited until the storm passed, she would lose whatever slim advantage it provided. Drawing a deep breath, she moved from her corner, careful to avoid the areas where men stood above. The trapdoor was located beneath the bearskin rug, in the main room currently occupied by at least 2 of Jenkins's men. Pearl had to time her move perfectly, waiting for a moment when their attention was directed elsewhere, and when thunder could mask the sound of the trapdoor opening. She positioned herself beneath the entrance, revolver tucked into the waistband of her skirt, and waited. The opportunity came during a particularly violent thunderclap. One of the men exclaimed about nearly being blinded by lightning through the window, drawing the other's attention. In that moment, Pearl pushed up on the trapdoor with all her strength, causing the rug above to shift. No one noticed. The men were at the window, their backs to her. Pearl lifted the trapdoor just enough to slide through, then lowered it silently behind her. She found herself crouched beside an overturned chair, the bearskin rug partially concealing her presence. Heart pounding, she surveyed the cabin. 2 men stood at the window, watching the storm. The third was presumably outside, sheltering somewhere with a view of the clearing. Pearl needed to reach the door without being seen, then somehow make her way through the storm to find Caleb before he returned to the trap. Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder. In that brief illumination, Pearl spotted something that made her blood run cold: Caleb's saddlebag lying open on the table, its contents scattered. So he had returned, had perhaps been captured already, or... No, she couldn't think that way. She had to believe he was still alive, still free. The men turned from the window and Pearl pressed herself lower behind the chair. They hadn't seen her yet, but discovery seemed inevitable in the small confines of the cabin. "This is a waste of time," Johnson complained. "We should be searching the area, not sitting here waiting." "In this." Roy gestured toward the window where rain lashed against the glass. "You'd get lost within 100 yards. No, we wait. When the storm passes, if Jameson hasn't shown, we'll track him." They moved toward the table, dangerously close to Pearl's hiding place. She held her breath, every muscle tense with the effort to remain absolutely still. Then, miracle of miracles, a new sound penetrated the storm's fury: 3 distinct knocks on the cabin door, followed by 2 more. The signal Caleb had arranged with Pearl. The men froze, exchanging triumphant glances. "That'll be him now," Roy said softly, drawing his revolver. "Johnson, get behind the door. "Williams, stay back but keep your gun ready." Pearl's mind raced. Caleb was alive but moments away from walking into a trap. She had only seconds to act. Drawing the revolver from her waistband, she rose from her hiding place. "Drop your weapons," she commanded, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear coursing through her. The men whirled, faces registering shock at her sudden appearance. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Roy's expression shifted to a calculating smile. Well, he drawled. "Looks like we won't need to wait for Jameson after all. The banker's daughter has decided to join us." "I said drop your weapons," Pearl repeated, aiming the revolver at Roy's chest. Her hand was rock steady, her father's voice echoing in her memory, "Never point a gun unless you're prepared to use it, Pearl." "You won't shoot," Roy said confidently, taking a step toward her. "A society girl like you doesn't have the stomach for it." The door rattled with another knock. Caleb, growing impatient or worried. Pearl knew she had only moments before he would try to enter and walk straight into the ambush. "I'm my father's daughter," Pearl said, steel in her voice. "And I've already lost everything except my life. Don't test how far I'll go to keep it." Something in her tone or expression must have convinced Roy. His smile faltered. But instead of dropping his weapon, he raised it with lightning speed, aiming directly at Pearl. She fired first. The report of the revolver was deafening in the confined space of the cabin. Roy staggered backward, a look of profound surprise crossing his face as red blossomed on his shirt front. He crumpled to the floor, his own gun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as he fell. The other two men reacted instantly. Johnson lunged for Pearl while Williams brought his gun to bear. Pearl dodged Johnson's grab, backing toward the door as she swung the revolver toward Williams. Before she could fire again, the cabin door burst open. Caleb stood framed in the doorway, rain-drenched and wild-eyed, his own weapon raised. He took in the scene. In an instant Roy sprawled on the floor, Johnson and Williams closing in on Pearl. "Pearl, down," he shouted. She dropped to her knees as Caleb fired twice in rapid succession. Johnson fell with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. Williams managed to return fire, his bullet splintering the doorframe inches from Caleb's head. In the chaos that followed, Pearl scrambled toward Caleb, staying low as bullets flew above her. When she reached him, he pulled her roughly behind him, shielding her with his body as he exchanged fire with Williams. It ended quickly. Williams, realizing he was outmatched with his companions down, threw his weapon aside and raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot," he pleaded. "I'm done." Caleb kept his revolver trained on Williams as he asked Pearl urgently, "Are you hurt?" "No," she managed, though she was shaking violently now that the immediate danger had passed. "I thought they'd captured you or worse." "I had to detour around a militia patrol," Caleb explained quickly, his eyes never leaving Williams. "It put me behind schedule when I saw strange horses outside." His voice tightened. "I thought I'd lost you." Pearl touched his arm, a silent reassurance that she was safe. Then, remembering the third man who should have been outside, she warned, "There's another one watching from the trees." Caleb nodded grimly. "Not anymore. I found him when I approached the cabin. He won't be reporting back to Jenkins." The implication hung in the air for a moment. Then Caleb addressed Williams, his voice hard. "On the floor, face down, hands behind your head." Williams complied, clearly terrified. Caleb quickly bound his hands with a length of rope, then checked Roy and Johnson. Roy was dead, his unseeing eyes fixed on the cabin ceiling. Johnson was alive but unconscious, blood seeping from the wound in his shoulder. "We need to bind his wound," Pearl said, looking at Johnson. Despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to wish death on the injured man. Caleb nodded, retrieving the medical supplies they had used for their own injuries. As he worked to stop Johnson's bleeding, he asked Pearl, "How did you end up in this situation? I thought you would be hidden in the root cellar." "I was," Pearl explained, still trembling with reaction. "All day. But when I heard your signal, I knew I had to warn you somehow. They were waiting to ambush you when you entered." Caleb paused in his ministrations, his eyes finding hers across the room. Something powerful passed between them, understanding, gratitude, and something deeper that neither was ready to name. "You saved my life," he said simply. Pearl managed a shaky smile. "We seem to be making a habit of that, saving each other." With both surviving outlaws securely bound, Caleb and Pearl were able to take stock of their situation. The storm continued to rage outside, making immediate travel impossible. They would have to wait it out in the cabin, sharing the space with their captives. "What will we do with them?" Pearl asked quietly, nodding toward Johnson and Williams. Caleb's expression was grim. "We'll take them to the federal marshal in Denver. Their testimony against Jenkins might be worth leniency for them." "You think they'll talk?" "With the right incentives, yes." Caleb looked at the men with hard eyes. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. They moved Johnson to one of the bedrooms where they could keep him under observation as he recovered from his wound. Williams remained bound in the main room, sullenly cooperative now that his options had narrowed to cooperation or a hanging. As the adrenaline of the confrontation faded, exhaustion overtook Pearl. She sank into a chair near the fire, suddenly aware that she had been awake for well over 24 hours, most of that time spent in the cramped confines of the root cellar. Caleb brought her a cup of coffee, kneeling beside her chair. "You should rest," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." Pearl shook her head. "Not yet. Tell me what happened at Miller's Creek. Did you get the letter posted?" "I did," Caleb confirmed. "It's on its way to Denver on the morning stage. But I was seen by someone who recognized me from the trading post. That's how they found my trail back here." Pearl nodded wearily. "They knew who I was. They knew you were helping me." "Jenkins is casting a wide net," Caleb said grimly. "But he's made a mistake now. Sending hired guns after us is one thing, evidence of his guilt is another." Pearl's eyes drifted to Roy's body, now covered with a blanket in the corner of the room. "I killed him," she said softly, the reality of it finally sinking in. I didn't think I could." Caleb covered her hand with his own. "You did what you had to do. He would have killed you without hesitation." "I know," Pearl whispered. "That doesn't make it easier." They sat in silence for a time, the storm's fury gradually subsiding to a steady rainfall. Pearl felt herself drifting toward sleep, her head growing heavy on her shoulders. "Come," Caleb said, helping her to her feet. "You need to sleep. I'll wake you if anything changes." Too exhausted to protest, Pearl allowed him to guide her to the bedroom that had been hers since they arrived at the cabin. As she sank onto the narrow bed, Caleb lingered in the doorway, watching her with an expression she was too tired to interpret. "Caleb," she said, fighting to keep her eyes open. "Thank you for coming back, for everything." His smile was gentle, warming his usually solemn features. "Rest now, Pearl. We'll figure out our next steps in the morning." As sleep claimed her, Pearl's last conscious thought was that despite the danger, despite the uncertain future, she was exactly where she needed to be. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world of glistening pine needles and clear mountain air. Pearl awoke to sunlight streaming through the cabin window and the distant call of a blue jay. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind, the events of the previous day seeming more like a terrible dream than reality. But the sounds from the main room confirmed the truth, low voices in conversation, the occasional clink of metal against metal, footsteps moving across the wooden floor. Pearl rose and dressed quickly, splashing water on her face from the basin Caleb had thoughtfully placed near her bed. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Caleb at the table with Williams, speaking in low, intense tones. Johnson was awake as well, propped against the wall with his hands bound before him, his wounded shoulder bandaged. Both men fell silent as Pearl appeared. "Good morning," Caleb said, rising from his chair. There were shadows beneath his eyes, evidence that he had kept watch through the night. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Pearl replied, though in truth she felt hollowed out as if the events of the previous day had carved something essential from her. Her gaze drifted to the corner where Roy's body had been, finding it empty. "Where?" "Took care of it at dawn," Caleb said quietly, understanding her unasked question. "Proper burial away from the cabin." Pearl nodded, grateful for his sensitivity. She couldn't have borne seeing the man she had killed, being constantly reminded of that terrible moment when the revolver bucked in her hand, and a life ended at her command. "I've been talking with Williams," Caleb continued, gesturing toward the sullen man at the table. "He's ready to cooperate in exchange for leniency." Williams looked up, his face haggard with fear and resignation. "Jenkins will kill me if he finds out I talked. I want protection." "Tell the marshal what you know, testify if needed, and I'll make sure you get it," Caleb promised. "Johnson, too, if he cooperates." The injured man glared from his position against the wall but said nothing. "What did he tell you?" Pearl asked, accepting the cup of coffee Caleb poured for her. "Enough to confirm what you suspected," Caleb replied grimly. "Jenkins has been using the silver mine as a front. The real money comes from robbing stage coaches and payroll shipments across 3 counties. He uses the mine to launder the stolen money, making it appear legitimate." "That's what Father discovered," Pearl said, understanding dawning. The discrepancies in the accounts, they weren't just bookkeeping errors or tax evasion. They were evidence of something much bigger. Williams nodded reluctantly. "Your pa was getting too close. Jenkins couldn't risk him going to the authorities. He thought with Remington dead and made to look like a robbery gone wrong, any investigation would die with him." "But I was there," Pearl said softly. "I saw everything." "That's why he's been hunting you so hard," Williams confirmed. "You're the only one who can connect him directly to the murder." Caleb's expression was thoughtful. "With Williams's testimony and Johnson's, plus your eyewitness account, we might have enough to convince the federal marshal to investigate Jenkins. But your father's journal would seal it." "If Margaret can find it," Pearl reminded him. The letter they had sent was their only hope of recovering the crucial evidence. "We need to get to Denver," Caleb decided. "It's safer than staying here, and we can meet with the federal marshal directly. Williams and Johnson will come with us as proof of our claims." The journey would be challenging. 4 people, 2 of them prisoners, traveling through rough country with limited supplies. But Pearl recognized the necessity of Caleb's plan. The cabin was compromised now, and Jenkins would certainly send more men when his first group failed to return. They spent the day preparing for departure. Caleb fashioned a travois that could be pulled behind Rusty to transport Johnson, whose wound made riding impossible. They gathered what supplies remained and packed them efficiently. Williams, realizing that his best chance for survival lay in cooperation, offered no resistance as they prepared him for travel. As evening approached, they made a final check of their preparations. They would leave at first light, hoping to cover significant ground before the heat of the day made travel difficult for the injured Johnson. "Try to get some sleep," Caleb advised Pearl as darkness fell. "Tomorrow will be demanding," but sleep proved elusive. Pearl lay awake in her small bedroom, listening to the night sounds of the forest, and the occasional murmur of voices from the main room, where Caleb kept watch over their prisoners. Her mind raced with thoughts of the journey ahead, of what awaited them in Denver, of whether Margaret would find the journal and understand Pearl's coded instructions. And beneath these practical concerns ran a deeper current of uncertainty. What would become of her relationship with Caleb once this ordeal was over? If they succeeded in bringing Jenkins to justice, what then? Would they simply part ways, returning to their separate lives? The thought brought an unexpected ache to Pearl's chest. In the short time since Caleb had found her wounded and hiding, he had become more than just her protector. He had become essential to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Unable to find rest, Pearl rose and moved quietly to the main room. Johnson was asleep in the corner, his breathing labored but steady. Williams dozed fitfully, bound securely to prevent escape. Caleb sat at the table, a cup of coffee cooling before him as he cleaned his revolver by the dim light of a single lamp. He looked up as Pearl entered, concern crossing his features. "Can't sleep," she shook her head, taking the chair opposite him. "Too much thinking." Caleb set aside the weapon, studying her face in the lamplight. "Having second thoughts about Denver?" "No," Pearl said truthfully. "It's the right move. I'm just wondering what comes after, if we succeed, if Jenkins is brought to justice. What then?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Caleb's eyes held hers, something vulnerable flickering in their depths. "I've been asking myself the same question," he admitted quietly. Pearl gathered her courage. "Before all this happened, I had a path laid out for me. Daughter of Harold Remington, eventual marriage to some suitable young man from Salada society, a predictable life of social calls and charity work." She gave a small, rueful smile. "None of it seems real anymore." "And what does seem real?" Caleb asked, his voice low. Pearl considered the question carefully. "This, being here, making choices based on what's right rather than what's expected." She hesitated, then added, "You seem real, Caleb. More real than anything in my life before." The confession cost her something in pride, but gained her something more valuable, the rare sight of Caleb Jameson's genuine smile, unguarded and warming his entire face. "I've spent most of my adult life drifting," he said after a moment. "Taking whatever work came my way, moving on when the seasons changed or the job ended, never staying long enough to put down roots." His eyes held Pearl's steadily. "Until now." The implication of his words sent a flutter through Pearl's chest. "And now," she prompted softly. "Now I find myself thinking about things I've never considered before. A permanent home, a future beyond the next season or paycheck." Caleb's voice grew hesitant, uncharacteristically uncertain. "A shared life, perhaps, if that's something you might want." Pearl's breath caught at the tentative offer contained in his words. It was perhaps the most unconventional courting speech ever delivered in a remote cabin, with two prisoners sleeping nearby, on the eve of a dangerous journey. Yet it felt entirely fitting for the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. "I think," she said carefully, "that when this is over, we should explore what that might look like. A shared life." Relief and something warmer flickered across Caleb's face. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The touch was simple, yet it contained a promise that words alone could not convey. They sat together in companionable silence until the first hints of dawn appeared at the cabin windows. Whatever the journey ahead might bring, they would face it not as protector and protected, but as partners bound by something deeper than circumstance. As the first golden rays of sunlight crested the eastern mountains, they gathered their few possessions and their prisoners, leaving behind the cabin that had been both refuge and battleground. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since witnessing her father's murder, Pearl felt the stirring of hope for the future. The journey to Denver was arduous but uneventful. They traveled by day and camped by night, avoiding settlements and keeping to less traveled routes where possible. Johnson's condition improved gradually, though he remained sullen and uncommunicative. Williams, by contrast, became increasingly talkative as they neared civilization, eager to share details of Jenkins's operation in hopes of securing leniency. On the fifth day, they crested a rise and saw Denver spread below them, a bustling frontier city of wooden buildings and wide streets, dominated by the imposing structure of the territorial courthouse. After the isolation of the mountains, the sight of so much human activity was almost overwhelming. "We should proceed carefully," Caleb advised as they paused to survey the city. Jenkins might have contacts here as well. They entered Denver as inconspicuously as possible, though a man leading a horse pulling a travois with a wounded prisoner inevitably drew some attention. Caleb guided them directly to the federal marshal's office near the courthouse, bypassing the local sheriff, whom he didn't trust to be free of Jenkins's influence. Marshal Robert Thornton was a square-built man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be easily impressed. He listened to their story with minimal interruption, his expression giving away nothing until Pearl described witnessing her father's murder. "Jenkins, you say?" Thornton rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I've heard rumors about his operations for years, but never had enough evidence to move on him." He gestured toward Williams and Johnson, "and these two are willing to testify in exchange for protection and reduced sentences," Caleb confirmed. "They can provide details on the stagecoach robberies, the money laundering through the mine, and Jenkins's other illegal operations." Thornton considered this, then nodded decisively. "I'll take their statements immediately and hold them in protective custody. As for you, Miss Remington," he studied Pearl with something like respect, "your testimony will be crucial if we're to convict Jenkins of murder." "I understand," Pearl said steadily. "I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary to see justice done for my father." "Good." Thornton rose from behind his desk. "For now, I suggest you find lodging somewhere discreet. If Jenkins has eyes in Denver, I don't want him learning you're here until we're ready to move against him." Caleb nodded in agreement. "We sent a letter to Pearl's former housekeeper in Salida, asking her to search for evidence that might further implicate Jenkins. If she found anything, she was instructed to send it to her sister's address here in Denver." "Alice Wilson on Larimer Street," Pearl supplied. "We should check there as soon as possible." Thornton dispatched deputies to secure Williams and Johnson, then provided Caleb and Pearl with directions to a small boarding house run by a widow he trusted. "Mrs. Hollister is discreet and doesn't ask questions," he assured them. "You'll be safe there while we prepare our case against Jenkins." After the wildness of the mountains and the primitive conditions of the trapper's cabin, the simple comforts of Mrs. Hollister's boarding house seemed like unimaginable luxury to Pearl. A real bed with clean linens, hot water for bathing, meals served on proper dishes, these everyday amenities had become precious through their absence. "I've arranged for proper clothing to be delivered," Caleb told Pearl after they had settled into their separate rooms. "Nothing fancy, but better suited to town than what we've been wearing." Pearl looked down at her makeshift attire, Caleb's oversized shirt belted over her tattered underskirt, and managed a small laugh. "I must look a fright. What will Mrs. Hollister think?" "That you're brave," Caleb said simply, "and that you've endured more than most could withstand." His unwavering faith in her strength continued to surprise Pearl. In Salida, She had been seen primarily as Harold Remington's daughter, a social ornament, whose worth was measured by her manners and marriageability. Caleb saw her differently as a partner worthy of respect, capable of courage and resilience. The following morning, dressed in the modest but clean clothing Caleb had procured, they made their way to Alice Wilson's home on Larimer Street. Pearl's heart raced with anticipation and anxiety. If Margaret had found her father's journal and understood Pearl's coded message, they might finally have the evidence needed to bring Jenkins to justice. Alice Wilson proved to be a stout, practical woman with Margaret's same direct manner. "You must be Pearl," she said without preamble when she opened the door. "Margaret said you might come. I have something for you." She led them into a neat parlor and retrieved a package wrapped in brown paper. "This arrived by private courier 3 days ago." Margaret paid extra to ensure it wouldn't be inspected along the way. Pearl accepted the package with trembling hands. It was heavy, approximately the size of a ledger book. She carefully unwrapped it, revealing a familiar red leather journal with her father's initials embossed on the cover. "She found it," Pearl breathed, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "Just where I thought it might be." Caleb leaned closer, his presence reassuring at her shoulder. "Is there a message from Margaret?" Alice nodded, producing a folded letter from her apron pocket. "She said to give you this as well, said it would explain everything." Pearl unfolded the letter, recognizing Margaret's neat, precise handwriting. "My dear Pearl, I pray this finds you safe. When your letter arrived, I knew at once what you were asking, though your caution in writing was wise. Jenkins has had men watching the house since that terrible night. They searched once, claiming to be helping the sheriff investigate, but I believe they were looking for exactly what I have now sent you. The journal was where you suggested, in the hidden compartment of your father's desk. I retrieved it the night after receiving your letter, while Jenkins's watchdog was distracted by a commotion I arranged in the street. I have sent it by trusted courier to Alice, along with this letter. You should know that Jenkins has spread word that you are confused and possibly deranged with grief, claiming you fled town after making wild accusations against him. Few believe this, but many are afraid to say otherwise publicly. The bank continues to operate under the supervision of Mr. Hargrove, though Jenkins seems to have an unusual interest in its management now. Be careful, dear child. Jenkins is not a man to cross lightly, as we have all learned at terrible cost. May your father's own words now bring him the justice he deserves. With love and prayers, Margaret Pearl handed the letter to Caleb, who read it quickly, his expression growing grim. We need to get this journal to Marshal Thornton immediately, he said. If it contains what we hope, it could be the final piece needed to move against Jenkins. They thanked Alice Wilson for her assistance and returned to the federal marshal's office. Thornton received them at once, his interest visibly piqued by the red journal Pearl placed on his desk. This belonged to my father, Pearl explained. He kept separate notes on all his significant banking matters, especially those that concerned him. Thornton opened the journal carefully, scanning the neat entries that filled its pages. Harold Remington had been meticulous in his record-keeping, noting dates, amounts, discrepancies, and his growing suspicions about Jenkins's business practices. This is extraordinary, Thornton murmured as he read. Your father documented everything unusual deposits, withdrawals that didn't match reported mine output, transfers to banks known to have questionable practices. He looked up at Pearl, genuine admiration in his eyes. Harold Remington was building a case, wasn't he? He wasn't just concerned as a banker, he was gathering evidence. Pearl nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Father believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. He suspected Jenkins was using the bank to launder money from illegal activities. The night he was killed, Jenkins accused him of looking too closely at the accounts. Thornton continued reading, pausing occasionally to make notes of his own. When he reached the final entries, dated just days before Harold Remington's murder, his expression hardened. "Your father made the connection between Jenkins and a series of stagecoach robberies in the territory," he said, tapping the page. He noted that each major deposit from Jenkins's mining operation coincided with a reported robbery. The amounts matched almost exactly. "Is it enough?" Caleb asked, the question that had been foremost in both their minds. Thornton closed the journal with a decisive snap. "With this, plus the testimonies of Williams and Johnson and Miss Remington's eyewitness account, yes, it's more than enough to arrest Jenkins and bring him to trial." He rose from his desk. "I'll send telegrams to the territorial governor and the federal judge today. We'll need to coordinate with local law enforcement in Salida for the arrest." "Jenkins has influence there," Pearl cautioned. "The sheriff might warn him." "Which is why we'll move quickly and decisively," Thornton assured her. "I'll lead the operation myself, with federal deputies rather than local men. Jenkins won't see us coming until it's too late." Over the next 3 days, Marshal Thornton prepared his case and his men. Pearl provided a detailed written statement about the night of her father's murder, while Caleb recounted the pursuit and the confrontation at the trapper's cabin. Williams and Johnson, secured in the federal jail, gave comprehensive accounts of Jenkins's criminal enterprises, motivated by the promise of reduced sentences. On the morning of the 4th day, Thornton and a contingent of 8 federal deputies departed for Salida. Pearl and Caleb remained in Denver, advised by the marshal to stay safely away until Jenkins was in custody. The waiting was agonizing. Hours stretched into a day, then 2, with no word from Salida. Pearl alternated between hope and despair, imagining all manner of scenarios: Jenkins escaping before the marshal arrived, a shootout resulting in lost evidence or witnesses, corruption extending higher than they had anticipated. Caleb was her anchor during this time of uncertainty. His steady presence and quiet confidence helped Pearl maintain her own resolve. They spent the waiting days exploring Denver together, always vigilant, but allowing themselves brief moments of normalcy: meals in small cafes, walks along the growing city streets, quiet conversations that increasingly turned to possibilities for the future. "If Jenkins is convicted," Pearl mused during one such conversation, "the bank will likely pass to me as father's heir. I could sell it, perhaps." "Is that what you want?" Caleb asked, attentive as always to her underlying feelings rather than just her words. Pearl considered the question carefully. "I don't know. Banking was father's passion, not mine, but it feels wrong somehow to simply walk away from what he built." "You could hire managers to run it," Caleb suggested. "Maintain ownership without being tied to Salida." The idea appealed to Pearl. "That would allow me to honor father's legacy while still building my own life." She glanced at Caleb, courage gathering for the question she had been considering. "What about you? What would you want if we truly considered a future together?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I've saved most of my wages over the years," he finally said. "Not enough to buy a proper ranch, but perhaps enough for a small parcel of land, some cattle, a modest house." His eyes met hers, vulnerable yet hopeful. "It could grow in time." The simple vision he painted touched Pearl deeply, not because of its grandeur, but because of its honesty. This was a man who dreamed within his means, who would build something solid and lasting rather than chase illusory fortunes. "I think," she said softly, That sounds like a wonderful beginning. On the morning of the third day after Thornton's departure, a telegram arrived at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house. The landlady brought it to Pearl's room, where she and Caleb had been sharing a quiet breakfast. Pearl opened it with trembling fingers, then read aloud. Jenkins arrested. Stop evidence secured. Stop return to Salida. Now safe. Stop trial set for next month. Stop. Thornton. Relief washed through Pearl like a physical force, leaving her light-headed. They did it, she whispered. It's over. Caleb's smile was as bright as she had ever seen it. Justice for your father at last. They departed for Salida the following day, traveling by stagecoach through the same wilderness they had recently traversed on horseback under such different circumstances. The journey seemed almost luxuriously easy by comparison, though Pearl found herself missing the quiet intimacy of their time at the trapper's cabin. Salida appeared unchanged as the stagecoach rolled down its main street, the same wooden buildings, the same dusty thoroughfare, the same mountains rising majestically in the background. Yet Pearl viewed it with new eyes, seeing both the familiar community she had known all her life and the darker undercurrents that had been hidden from her until her father's murder. Their arrival caused a sensation. Word spread quickly that Harold Remington's daughter had returned, accompanied by the ranch hand who had helped her escape Jenkins's assassins. By the time they reached the Remington house, a small crowd had gathered, watching with undisguised curiosity. Margaret Wilson met them at the door, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she embraced Pearl. "Oh, my dear girl," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I feared I might never see you again." "It's good to be home," Pearl replied, surprised to find she meant it despite everything that had happened. "Thank you for finding Father's journal. It made all the difference." Inside the house, everything was exactly as Pearl had left it on the night she fled. Her father's books in their places on the shelves, his favorite chair positioned near the fireplace, the framed photographs of Pearl's mother still adorning the mantelpiece. The familiarity was both comforting and painful. "The house has been kept ready for your return," Margaret explained as she prepared tea in the kitchen. "Mr. Hargrove at the bank made sure the bills were paid and everything maintained. He's been most concerned about your welfare." Over the next days, Pearl reintegrated into Salida society, though she found her perspective irrevocably altered by her experiences. Many who had been social acquaintances before now seemed shallow and inconsequential. Conversations about dresses and socials held little interest for a woman who had fled for her life, hidden in a root cellar, and killed a man to save another. Caleb remained by her side throughout, a steady presence that both comforted Pearl and scandalized certain elements of Salida society. A banker's daughter openly associating with a ranch hand was unconventional, to say the least. But Pearl found she cared little for convention now. Marshal Thornton visited before returning to Denver, updating them on the case against Jenkins. "He's being held in the territorial prison in Denver," Thornton informed them. "The evidence is overwhelming. Your father's journal, the testimonies, financial records seized from his home and offices. He'll hang for murder and spend the rest of his days in prison for the other crimes." "And his men?" Caleb asked. "Those we could identify are being rounded up. Some fled when they heard of Jenkins's arrest. Williams and Johnson will receive reduced sentences for their cooperation, as promised." Thornton looked at Pearl with genuine respect. "Your father would be proud of what you've done, Miss Remington. It took courage to stand against a man like Jenkins." "I had help," Pearl said simply, her hand finding Caleb's beside her. The marshal smiled, noting the gesture. "Indeed you did. Good day to you both." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Pearl and Caleb alone in the parlor of the Remington home. "What now?" Caleb asked quietly, the question encompassing far more than their immediate plans. Pearl considered for a moment. "I need to speak with Mr. Hargrove about the bank. And there's Father's will to settle, the house to consider." She paused, meeting Caleb's gaze directly. "But those are details. The larger question is where we go from here together." "Together," Caleb echoed, the word carrying a promise. "I meant what I said in Denver, Pearl. If you'll have me, I want to build a life with you." Pearl's heart swelled with certainty. The path ahead might not be the one she had once envisioned, but it was infinitely more meaningful. "I can think of nothing I want more," she said simply. Their courtship progressed with the same directness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Pearl assumed control of her father's bank, but hired competent managers to handle day-to-day operations. Caleb found work at a ranch outside Salida, saving his wages to add to the nest egg he had accumulated over years of wandering. 3 months after Jenkins's arrest, they were married in a small ceremony in the Salida church. Margaret Wilson wept openly, while Mr. Hargrove from the bank gave the bride away in Harold Remington's absence. Marshall Thornton traveled from Denver for the occasion, his presence a reminder of the unusual circumstances that had brought the couple together. Garrett Jenkins's trial proceeded as expected. The evidence against him was insurmountable, and the jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to hang for the murder of Harold Remington and received additional sentences for the stagecoach robberies and financial crimes. Pearl attended the sentencing, Caleb at her side. As Jenkins was led from the courtroom, he looked directly at her with undisguised hatred. But Pearl found the gaze no longer held power over her. Justice had been served, and she had a future to embrace. With Pearl's inheritance and Caleb's savings, they purchased a modest ranch 20 miles outside Salida, close enough to manage the bank's affairs when necessary, but far enough to build a life separate from the shadows of the past. The land was good, with fertile pastures for cattle and a clear stream running through the property. The house was small but solid, with room to expand as their family grew. In the spring following their marriage, as new grass carpeted the Colorado foothills and wildflowers bloomed across the meadows, Pearl shared news that brought joy to them. Both a child would join their family by winter. Caleb's reaction was everything Pearl could have hoped for: wonder, tenderness, and a renewed determination to create a safe and loving home. "I never imagined this," he confessed one evening as they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "After my parents died, I convinced myself I wasn't meant for this kind of happiness: a home, a wife, a child on the way." Pearl leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach. "And I never imagined falling in love with a cowboy who found me wounded and stood guard," she said with a smile. "But I can't picture any other life now." "Nor can I," Caleb agreed, his arm tightening around her. "It seems that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead exactly where we're meant to be." As darkness settled over their land, stars appearing one by one in the vast Colorado sky, Pearl reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From tragedy and danger had come love and hope, a future built on courage and trust, rather than convention and expectation. It wasn't the life she had been raised to expect. It was better, richer, truer, and infinitely more precious for having been fought for and won against daunting odds. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, Pearl knew with bone-deep certainty that she and Caleb would face them as they had faced everything since that fateful day in the canyon together, with unwavering resolve and a love forged in the wild heart of the West. In the years that followed, their ranch flourished, expanding as their family grew. Their first child, a son they named Harold after Pearl's father, was joined 2 years later by a daughter they called Elizabeth, after Caleb's mother. The Jameson Ranch became known throughout the region for its fine cattle and the warm hospitality of its owners. Pearl maintained her ownership of the Remington Bank, occasionally traveling to Salida to oversee major decisions, but largely leaving day-to-day operations to trusted managers. The bank's reputation for honesty and fair dealing, a legacy of Harold Remington's principled approach to business, continued under her guidance. Caleb found in ranching a fulfillment he had never known in his years of drifting. The knowledge gained during his travels served him well as he built their herd and improved their land. His past experiences with droughts, harsh winters, and cattle diseases helped him prepare for challenges that devastated less knowledgeable ranchers. Their home grew along with their family and prosperity: additional rooms, a larger kitchen, a covered porch that wrapped around the house where they could sit on summer evenings and watch their children play in the yard. Yet they maintained the simple, honest approach to life that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Sometimes, on cool autumn evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done for the day, Pearl and Caleb would ride together to a ridge overlooking their property. There, with the vast Colorado wilderness spread before them, they would remember the desperate flight that had brought them together and marvel at the life they had built from such unlikely beginnings. "You ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't found me that day in the canyon?" Pearl asked on one such evening as they sat side by side on a fallen log, their horses grazing nearby. Caleb considered the question, his face solemn in the fading light. "I try not to," he admitted. "The thought of what might have befallen you." He shook his head, unable to complete the sentence. "Let's just say I'm grateful every day that I decided to investigate those riders circling the old mining cabin." Pearl leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "As am I. Though I suspect you'd have had a far less complicated life if you'd ridden on." Caleb smiled, the expression warming his weather-lined face. "Less complicated, perhaps, but infinitely less meaningful." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I wouldn't trade what we've built together for anything, Pearl. Not for all the silver in Colorado." As they rode back to their home in the gathering dusk, Pearl reflected that the most precious gifts often come disguised as hardships. The tragedy that had taken her father and upended her carefully ordered life had ultimately led her to greater joy than she might otherwise have known: a love born of courage and sacrifice, a family built on shared values and genuine partnership, a life rich with purpose and meaning. The lights of their ranch house welcomed them home, golden against the deepening blue of the evening sky. Inside, their children slept peacefully. Tomorrow's chores waited, and the future stretched before them, a future they would continue to build together, one day at a time, in the wild and beautiful land they both loved. And if sometimes Pearl awoke in the night, momentarily startled by a dream of running, of hiding, of desperados' bullets whining past her head, Caleb's arms would be there to hold her, his voice gentle in the darkness, reminding her that she was safe, that they had weathered the storm together, that their love had been forged in fire and would endure through whatever life might bring. In this way, the wounded woman who had hidden from outlaws and the cowboy who had found her first and stood guard created not just a home or a ranch or a family, but a legacy of courage and love that would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the healing power of devotion and the unexpected blessings that can arise from life's darkest moments.